Humans, controllers or not, die. Easily, Cassie said. And yet, Visser One mused, and yet, the casualty reports from Earth are always weighted heavily toward Hork-Bajir and taxons. In fact, I am trying to recall when I have ever seen a report listing a human controller casualty.
When I started revisiting this series for the first time since the 90s, I didn't start with the invasion. I actually started with the reunion, mostly because it was the earliest book that I remembered absolutely nothing about. This exchange jumped out at me. I wasn't the only one. Oh, younger Torin, spouting off half-remembered and incorrect facts. Don't you know that's how misconceptions get started? Anyway, I wanted to see Visser One's casualty reports. I thought, if this series had been as popular as Star Trek, someone would have done this 20 years ago. Probably in red hypertext on a low-res Starfield background, maybe with dancing dome ship gifs in the corner. I could just look it up. Yeah, kind of like that. But hey, I can improve on this. Maybe I can do a better job at anamorphing than Alan Fangor. And so, after way too much page flipping, control effing, tallying, note-taking, spreadsheets, more spreadsheets, contradictory spreadsheets, and almost 2 years on and off in the making, may I present the latest in a long string of ill-advised, unasked-for data projects, the Animorphs Kill Counter. We're now 3 books from the end of the series, and we need to pause. Ooh, Rachel's in the lead. We all saw that coming. Hold your horse, Morphs, you're being misled. We need to talk about a few key incidents. Like Ellimist and Krayak, I have some rules of engagement.
Rule number 1. I got better.
Instead of an absolute number, think of this counter as a lower bound. Every victim gets every benefit of the doubt for survival. The narration often mentions the characters pulling their punches with humans specifically, and it's hard to tell exactly what a Hork-Bajir can survive, but as one example, in The Change, Ket Halpak gets hit by a truck, and it doesn't seem to matter at all. A single punch or paw swipe in this universe doesn't cut it. For that matter, Tobias's trademark eye gouging and Axe's tree and limb removal services aren't fatalities either. This approach tends to severely undercount Rachel and Marco, which is frustrating in scenes like the Grizzlies' first appearance, when Rachel completely loses it against an unknown number of controllers. A double-digit count for that scene alone would be believable, and she gets nothing.
Rule number 2.
2 for 1 every Wednesday.
I think this one's obvious, but a dead controller counts for 2, the host and the Yeerk. Rule 3. Minimal, literal. Sometimes we're blessed with real numbers, but usually we have only a vague impression. So we take crowd estimates literally, but minimally. About a dozen equals 12. About 100 equals 100. Pluralization matters. Absent other context, thousands equals 2,000. The phrase about a dozen happens so often that I formalized it as its own corollary. Hork-Bajir seem to come in 12 packs. Rule 4.
I'm 40%!
Taxon.
Based on a wild extrapolation from a single line in Visser, for large groups we assume 40% as many Taxons as Hork-Bajir. Rule 5. Not my problem. I didn't even try to count casualties that take place in alternate realities, dream sequences, and Sario Rip events. Rule 6. Last touch. The last Animorph to engage a still-living enemy, or more generally, the last one in a causal chain that leads to an enemy death, gets full credit. I wonder if that'll cause any huge problems.
Learn your rules. You better learn your rules. If you don't, you'll be eaten in your sleep.
Some debated fan canon I'd like to specifically address. The controller cop who harasses Cassie throughout the invasion is clearly implied to have died. I credited it as a team kill, resisting my urge to give it to Cassie outright, but contradicting those who assume he was just caught in Visser 3's crossfire. Not on the list, Joe Bob Finestra or David. Armed with these rules, let's ignore the skirmishes and any uncomfortable reminders of our own reality, and focus on the real driver of these numbers in this series written for children: mass casualty events. When Tobias destroys the truck ship in the encounter, a dozen Taxxons have been dispatched from the Blade ship. I struggled with how many Taxxons to assign to the ship's crew, but then the graphic novel came out. Chris Grine illustrates 6 Taxxons on the bridge, and I've decided to canonize it. On the way down, the ship takes out a bug fighter with a standard crew of 1 Hork-Bajir and 1 Taxxon, and a helicopter with a Hork-Bajir gunner and a human pilot. This gives the Animorphs their first unambiguous human casualty. This lone event also gives Tobias about 2/3 of his kills for the entire series.
Now that is irony!
In the capture, Jake boils about 100 Yeerks, so he gets credit for 99. The last one is Temrash 114, and he goes on the team counter, because he was clearly a group effort. And like all group projects, there's that one member who shares credit despite doing absolutely nothing. Sure, TV Jake steals credit through the last touch rule, but that's a different video. Eric's Berserker Rampage in the Android comprises 20 humans, 24 Hork-Bajir, and 100% fatality rate. In a surprising bit of continuity, Cassie dreams about the incident and the departure, and gives the same count as Marco. I spent entirely too long trying to come up with a defensible number for the shark complex in the escape, but we have a few hints. After Visser 1 thwarts Axe's attempt to self-destruct the facility, Marco accomplishes the same thing by throwing a chair. Makes sense. Since the facility is destroyed by flooding, for once, the Taxxons get a break. Except that one in particular. The Hork-Bajir aren't so lucky. There are at least 8 alive when the flooding starts. Visser 1 rallies half a dozen to their feet, berates another, while Rachel is still actively fighting another one. Then Visser 3 arrives with an honor guard of 12 in aquatic survival gear. They don't join the fight. The 12-pack rule and the knowledge that Visser 1 wouldn't intentionally meet Visser 3 outnumbered lets us assign her the same number. Her honor guard is not in aquatic gear. Also, most of them are bleeding, and surrounded by Taxxons, and sharks that are about to lose their mind control chips. They're not gonna make it. It gets worse! Visser 1 mistakenly believes Marco was one of the 4 technicians that Visser 3 dispatched, so apparently there are 4 real technicians running around. Finally, in Marco's mid-book description of Visser 1's conveniently transparent submarine, he observes a mixed crew of Hork-Bajir, Taxxons, Geds, and humans. When the Animorphs arrive at the facility, the sub is empty, except for a few Taxxons. We've accounted for the Hork-Bajir. We need to allow for at least 2 additional humans and Geds. When the facility floods, the lone Lyran gets Visser 1 aboard her sub, which is presumably then piloted out by the Taxxons already on board. We've now accounted for all human controller fatalities up to Book 30, and Visser 1 was there for the last 6. Now let's lighten the mood a little with the David Trilogy. I was surprised that the only controller death in the trilogy is caused by David's dad, when he welcomes a Hork-Bajir to Earth by shooting him. Specifically, this Hork-Bajir, whose foot is the first official artwork we ever got of the species. Also, he'd just been poisoned. By Marco. I reluctantly needed to put the Nartek on here because they taxidermy 24 Hork-Bajir. Later, Rachel single-handedly, literally because she's using one as a shield in her other hand, fights off 12 of them, but it's so vague that the only fatalities I could award were the 2 that Tobias maces in the face. No, maces in the face. I realized the Nartek wouldn't go on a Yeerk casualty report. For that matter, the Howler that Jake kills in the attack is on here too, and so is the Valik, even though it's non-sentient. A disappointing count for a disappointing book. In The Weakness, they crash a Learjet into the Yeerk pool. Axe flies the plane, but it's actually Rachel who touches the controls last. I credited her with 100. That feels too low to me. In reality, something like this would absolutely take out the whole pool and probably the whole complex, but that's clearly not what the author intended. This takes Rachel from second to last to first place. This feels flimsy to me. I don't like it, but trust me, it's not going to make a difference. Skipping ahead a bit, I had to do it again, this time for the revelation. Axe boils some Yeerks when they restart the engines of their bug fighter that gently crashed into the pool. For that, I gave him 50.
Got to 50!
Maybe the Yeerks were smart enough to swim away this time. Again, it won't make a real difference. The battle for the Hork-Bajir Valley and the Resistance was similarly frustrating. Toby's Hork-Bajir suffer heavy casualties, except maybe they don't, because in the answer, Toby has the same number again. Maybe she mobilized the children and the disabled. It's a very Animorphs thing to do. Anyway, I resorted to 1960s Batman logic and started counting instances of onomatopoeia as evidence of kills. The booby traps that impale groups of Taxxons 2 and 3 layers deep helps give a nice Taxxon minimum. In this battle only, every Hork-Bajir that falls is counted as a death. The valley is violently flooded moments later and any unconscious Hork-Bajir would drown. Still, this is clearly an undercount. Also, a drowned Taxxon? Seriously? I'm just going to say Jake is wrong.
Toby, this is different. He's already dead.
Now we have to go back to the decision. Speaking of decisions, I totally chose to present the data this way for added context and not because a strict chronological account ruins the aesthetics of the chart. In the decision, Axe blows up a continent. I already gave him credit for the dozen Hork-Bajir that drop in on him last minute and a lone Hork-Bajir scout on the coast, but less than a day earlier there was a battle between, in Tobias's words, about 1,000 Hork-Bajir plus Taxxons versus about 100 Andalites. My main goal was to reduce this number. I gave the Andalites a 3-to-1 combat kill ratio and assumed they retreated once they sustained 50% casualties. I figured the Andalite air support could strafe a handful of Taxxons each before they were shot down or retreated, leaving us with this number. We have an even worse situation in the Prophecy. Under Aldrea's pseudo-control, Cassie describes a billion-gallon Yeerk pool containing perhaps 10,000 Yeerks. They use an old Andalite ship to burn a hole in the side of the pool, causing thousands to drain out. Minlet sets that to 2,000. Cassie/Aldrea expects the surviving controllers will rescue some by hand, so I'm going to very generously give back 10%, leaving 1,800 dead Yeerks. And it's Axe who pulls the trigger. This section is terse, and this book in particular has a reputation for being poorly edited. When they're approaching the Hork-Bajir homeworld, Axe is flying and Aldrea/Cassie work the weapons, but when they take off in the second ship, the positions are reversed. Not gonna lie, it made a much more compelling narrative to pin this on Cassie. We can't blame Aldrea, she's literally dead. I'm not crediting a chatbot with 1,800 kills. That might change. But Last Touch has no time for sentiment. In The Arrival, the 4 Andalites from Apex Intelligence interrupt a traditional Animorph skirmish with shredders that are not set to stun. For this I gave Aloth, Arbat, Gonrod, and Launcher of 1,000 Ships, Estrid, 2 controllers each. Later, in the bungled assassination attempt on Visser 3, we rack up some more, including, notably, several humans. All small jelly beans compared to Gonrod at the controls of the Rallick River, flash boiling a circular region of the Yeerk pool 50 feet across, a quarter of the total surface area, netting him a very defensible 250 kills. Man, you do not want to be an unhosted Yeerk in the series. Speaking of which, we finally move forward in time to the sacrifice. I almost had to add myself to the counter after this.
I'm afraid we need to use math.
They finally do it. The Animorphs make good on the brash suggestion Tobias makes back in the invasion and blow up the Yeerk pool. They cave in houses and office buildings. Half the mall goes with it. The Animorphs inconsistently switch between thousands and tens of thousands in projected casualties. Visser 1 echoes the thousands number. Obviously, the Yeerks have increased the Yeerk pool stock from about 1,000 in the underground to thousands here. I'm fine with that. But if they're making thousands of new controllers per day, like the Animorphs believe, most of the Yeerks are out of the pool and in people during the bombing. Minlet takes us back down to 2,000 unhosted or currently feeding Yeerks. Peter believes the effect of the underground bombing will be similar to a small nuke. In The Deception, when Axe threatens to nuke the town for real, he speculates a detonation right over the Yeerk pool would cause 10 to 20,000 human casualties. The smallest nuclear weapon in the U.S. arsenal is 0.3 kilotons. There'd be radioactive fallout over a fully populated town with no warning. I treated this as an upper bound. Axe observes normal rush hour traffic isn't happening the morning of the bombing. The state's governor has announced the invasion on TV. Many bystanders have apparently already fled. That helps reduce the number. Did you know there's a website that lets you simulate nuclear blasts over any location you choose? I'm not going to tell you exactly where, but I selected a real U.S. suburb in the right general area, with a mall and a major amusement park not too far outside the blast radius, and simulated a no-fallout surface detonation of a 0.1 kiloton weapon. I have no way to simulate a subterranean detonation, but even 0.1 kilotons is 10 to 20 times as powerful as 10 conventional 1,000-pound bombs. Hopefully it evens out. I positioned it as such that the edge of the blast overlapped with the mall. I did it again and again.
Are you coming to bed soon?
Can't. Pretending to nuke the West Coast.
Why?
Animorphs. I'm surprised at how small the numbers were. It was nearly impossible to even get into the 4 digits. The magic number I settled on was 940 human casualties. We're not done. To account for the families who fled, I put only half the expected bystanders on the surface, but the other half are in the Yeerk pool, representing innocent people abducted from all over the city. Of those, half are currently infested. The others are in line to be, or in the cages. Add 1 Hork-Bajir for every 5 humans. 90% currently infested. Apply the 40% rule for Taxxons, all infested, and that's the number I went with. For this, I so badly want to ignore Last Touch. Everyone is involved in this mission. The Animorphs, the parents, Toby and several free Hork-Bajir, the auxiliaries, even the military. If they'd done the simplest and safest thing and set the bombs to detonate on impact, I'd have probably been forced to share these casualties amongst about 40 people. But the Animorphs chose to provide some warning to give the prisoners and even controllers some hope of escaping. So Axe, Cassie, and Marco ride the train in what is assumed to be a one-way trip with a detonator and a time delay. Jake implies that Cassie has last-minute veto over the mission, which she does not exercise. Marco and Axe flip a coin, and Axe wins. So once again, he causes the explosion via Last Touch. If I can be meta for a second, the dramatic reason why Axe works the detonator is simply because he's narrating. The narration cycle changed late in the series to give Axe and Tobias equal book frequency. The real endgame comes in the next book, The Answer, which could only have been narrated by Jake, but Axe narrating the sacrifice honestly seems like an accident. There are a few books that don't really fit their narrator, as evidenced by the narrators completely lacking character arcs in those entries. The reveal that the Andalites are coming with intent to destroy Earth, Axe's falling out with Cassie, and their ultimate reconciliation are great. But once the characters all depart on the mission to obtain the bombs halfway through the book, Axe ceases to be the protagonist and just becomes a passive narrator. If the cycle hadn't changed, this would have been Marco's book. Peter factors heavily into the book, and Marco was sent on the train as leader in Jake's place. If this had been Marco's book, he absolutely would have won the coin toss and worked the detonator. But he didn't. We have some minor pickups in The Answer before we get to our last discussion point. Finally, for once, we have a hard and fast number for the famous and infamous flushing of the pool ship. 17,372. Jake gives the order. Flush them. Which means our fearless leader, Prince Jake Berenson, Jake the Yeerk Killer, will have to settle for a very distant 5th place because those kills clearly belong to Axe. Haven't you been paying attention? I have all the sympathy for Axe's situation and the sacrifice, but here, he clearly instigated it. Prince Jake? Oh, Prince Jake, your interior monologue tells me you're looking for a way to distract Visser 1, and I just couldn't help but notice that I have a suspiciously convenient kill all the Yeerks button right here. Now I could, purely hypothetically mind you, maybe, if you're alright with it, just give it a little push. Prince Jake? Prince Jake? Yeah, Jake feels guilty for it. It's a great final bit of character development in an epic war tragedy. And of course, Visser One's lawyers in The Hague try to pin it on Jake in a case of zealous whataboutism. That's to be expected. But Axe pushed the button.
The destruction of my enemies, my most solemn vow.
This exchange between Axe and Aldreabot isn't exactly vindicating either.
Once we create a hole, the water will rush in and through. It will create a vast drain that will empty much of the pool and suck many of the Yeerks to their doom.
Yes, Aldrea said. Do you object, Brother Andalite?
No, Sister Hork-Bajir, I do not.
I always intended to cheekily give the pool ship incident to Axe, but I'd honestly forgotten about the detonator and the sacrifice. I assumed I was going to have to split that between Axe, Marco, and Cassie, if not all 6 Animorphs or even everyone. And I'd entirely forgotten about partially draining the Yeerk pool in the prophecy. I'm sorry, I just don't care for that book. I started using the last touch rule early on in an effort to make things easier on myself. Examples: Tobias shoots at the bridge of the truck ship, but it's a complete fluke that the out-of-control ship then careens into a bug fighter and a helicopter. Are those on Tobias, or is that a friendly fire incident? In The Illusion, a Hork-Bajir engages Marco while Marco is trying to free Tobias from his suspended cube prison. Marco doesn't fight the Hork-Bajir directly, but his efforts to free Tobias result in the Hork-Bajir falling a great height and brutally impaling itself on its own blades. It helps make a complicated approach easier by allowing me to just unambiguously assign these incidents to a single character. I did not realize the same rule would force me to put the top 4 mass casualty incidents entirely on Axe, or that the 5th incident would be on a cowardly Andalite that we never see again. Now, Catherine Applegate and Michael Grant have been admirably transparent about how the series was assembled seat-of-the-pants style, so I don't want to project too much intentionality on this. It's entirely likely this was an accident. But I wonder, was making Axe the designated trigger puller some kind of effort to somehow protect the human characters from the bloodiest incidents? Or is it meant to say something about the Andalites themselves? I can't help but notice that, with the exception of the pool ship flush, none of these incidents are Axe's idea. He's always following orders. Commander Gallowit in The Decision, the algorithmic recreation of Aldrea in The Prophecy, Jake formally ordering what had been unanimously agreed to ahead of time in The Sacrifice, and in my opinion, Axe manipulated his way into getting the order he wanted on the pool ship. I recognize the gross oversimplification of putting 100% of the glory or blame for incidents like this on the button pusher. Suddenly, this silly vanity project around a niche and, let's face it, largely forgotten fictional universe takes on very real-world implications. The phrase, "I was only following orders," has come to be associated with the most disgusting mass abdication of personal responsibility in history. And rightly so. Then again, few would put sole blame, or even a large share of the blame, of, say, Hiroshima on the bombardier of the Enola Gay. Numbers can illuminate or obscure the truth. The randomness and capriciousness of war, or history in general, rarely lends itself to a satisfying narrative. Catherine and Michael knew that, and really, if anything elevates Animorphs beyond a pulpy, trope-laden, dated 90s relic, it's that sensibility. Of course this project would simultaneously disappoint me and remind me of why the series is so awesome. Anyway, here are some more charts.
I'm afraid of Americans. I'm afraid of the world. I'm afraid I can't help it. I'm afraid I can't. I'm afraid of Americans. I'm afraid of the world. I'm afraid I can't help it. I'm afraid I can't. I'm afraid of Americans. Johnny's in America, Johnny looks up at the stars. Johnny combs his hair, Johnny wants pussy and cars. Johnny's in America. is in America. God is in America.
There's a slim chance the Cassie Rolling Stone interview will clarify this if it ever comes out, but as far as we know, here's the kill counter for Animorphs 2.0.